How's it going? It's been way too long since the last video, but that's fine. I've still been working on the game, and which is good because I did say that videos come second to actually making it, and since it's been a while, there have been numerous things that I want to cover and share. So because of this, the video will be in its structure. It'll be more like an update with a bunch of mini devlogs where I go over multiple systems rather than a video focused solely on one system. So the first thing I would like to cover is that I'd like to announce that we are setting a due date for playtests that we have planned. This, as far as I'm aware, at least as of now, it's not a public playtest. It's just for us to send to some friends, and that due date is March 19th. So the purpose of this test isn't to go into the full loop. It's just to generally get people's opinion on how the game feels in its most basic moment to moment. I'm not even sure if we can hit this date, but that's exactly why I am saying it publicly. I made it a little tight on purpose just to, light my own fire a little bit. I'm not too concerned about whether or not we actually hit it. I don't want to induce crunch, but it would be really nice to hit it. And so with this playtest, we simply hope just to get the game in a good spot and in a good rhythm, get some proper feedback, which is something we failed to do, and hopefully simply get people interested. Either way, the reason that we are holding off till that date is because there's stuff that we know needs to be fixed and could impact their opinion on how the game feels to play. We wrote up this 13-page document for everything that needs to be done, and it will get done. But now I will transition to where I left off in the previous video where I said I had to make the two-tool system. So now for the two-tool system, honestly, it was a lot easier than I thought it would be. I'm willing to go back into the trenches for the two-tool system because that is important and that is integral to the game. Now the game has the player using two tools as the default. One is activated using right click, the other is activated using Q. And there still are some presentation problems, such as not showing which button activates which in the UI, and the information for the second tool not showing up in the shop. And that's fine. That can come in the polish stage once we firmly establish that we are sticking with it. For why it was so easy, I think that a lot of it came down to that I had already made the tool system so modular. So the way that the tool system is implemented is that I have this parent object called the alt-fire holder. I made this when tools were called alt-fires, just alternate fire. And within this holder, we place the actual tool as a child object. And this holder, within its script, it has something called a broadcast message. What this type of function does is it takes the name of a function as the argument, and then it looks within itself and it looks within all of its children to see if anything happens. For example, if we had a function called fire, it would look within itself and look within all of its children, and every single instance of the function fire, it would activate that. So since it just goes by the name and then runs the function, every single tool, again the child object, has the function with the name the holder is looking for, which activates the tool. This way, whenever we swap out a tool, we just remove one and put another one in as a child. All that the holder does is send out its message, and then the tool does the job from there, making it very modular. Using this setup, all that I had to do was duplicate everything. The downside of this setup from the more macro tool system and the way it's implemented everywhere, it makes it so I can't use this tactic if I wanted to give classes a range of 0 to 3 tools. I think I would need to completely go back and refactor stuff, but now that I know that for future projects, I'll be able to have that in mind. But for this one, doubling it did the job. I made copies of every single required variable. I made a second alt-fire holder. I made it so that the tools themselves know which slot they're in, and then once I did all of that, I got it working pretty much immediately, other than some small issues with forgetting connections to mechanics or such or other, like saving. I had to get it working again with the save system and add in the second tool into the save system, which was pretty easy. So yeah, I mean, I dreaded it so much and thought it was going to be really difficult, and in the end it was tedious, but it took me half or probably even only a third of the amount of time I expected it to, which was really nice. So the dummy is one of the tools in the game. The purpose of it is it acts as a distraction to the enemies so that you have a chance to get away. Sort of, you place it on the ground and the enemies target the dummy for a brief period of time till they go back to chasing you. So at the very beginning I made a really rough version of it and just sort of kept it as that for a long time and never really touched it again, never really tested with it again. And since then I've made so many changes to the enemies, to how the AI works, and also the way that enemies come into the level. They spawn in over the course of a round rather than being there inherently in the level. And so none of them worked with a dummy anymore, and I had to fix that. It ended up being a lot longer of a process than I expected it to be. One of the first and most interesting things that I learned is that trigger colliders don't hit an object if there's no movement. The first enemy I fix is what's currently called the Associate, and this is that robed dude who has a melee attack. And so when the enemy arrived within range of the dummy, it would attack. And so the Associate would still have a slight bit of movement when it started attacking. This is because the friction hadn't completely brought it to a complete stop yet. And so while there was some movement, the enemy would attack and the dummy would take damage. Once it got to its third or fourth attack, the dummy would stop taking damage, and this happened as well with the exposed slime enemy, which is the green dude with the wiggly arms. If I planted the dummy within the arms, it wouldn't take any damage. It took me a while to figure out what was going on and that movement was required in order for damage to be taken, and so my solution was finally to give the dummy some movement. I designed the dummy like a scarecrow, and it made me think of the dancing scarecrow from The Legend of Zelda: Ocarina of Time and Majora's Mask. So I gave the dummy a little jig of an animation, and now no matter what, because of that jig that moves around the collider, the dummy would be damaged even if the enemy is at a standstill. I now realize that I bet that's not what was going on, the whole movement thing. I bet it's because either the attack or the dummy or both lacked rigid bodies, and I bet if I added one to the dummy it would have fixed it would work fine. But I guess that's dev for you. I'm the dummy. Oh well, it got me to finally polish the dummy a bit and give it a fun and satisfying animation. So, and then the second part is simply getting the dummy to work at all. And so there are two systems that I needed to fight with: enemies in the room already, and then enemies that haven't spawned yet. So the first one is a more complex one, where the AI of all these enemies has gotten quite complex to how they were when I first started making the game. Some of these enemies also have multiple states or multiple parameters that they operate in. For example, these shooter enemies, they try to stay within a certain range of the player. If you get too close, they will back up, but if you run away, they will chase you. Or the coin, which has multiple states where it acts completely differently. For the most part, it was fairly simple, just tedious with some unique problems for each enemy. I already had a variable that stood in place for the position of the player, that variable being target position. I just swapped target position from being assigned to the player's position and changed it to the dummy's position. And that solved most of it. From there I did have to, and I'm actually still doing a lot of specific maneuvering for each enemy, such as getting around the whole target ring thing that some enemies use. I have a video on that ring, or having specific parameters for what the enemy needs to do based upon the context of the dummy being out of the relative position. Some enemies fire shots and have to aim at the dummy relative to the player, and the thing that fires the shots is a separate AI, which is their bullet spawner. It was quite a lot of finagling all those systems, but once I got it working for one, it would work for every single other similar one just with some copy and pasting. The second part was that the enemies did not target the dummy when the enemy spawns after the dummy was already on the field. This was the easiest fix of them, and it was literally just at the start of the enemy spawning, check to see if there's a dummy on the field. If there is, change the target to the dummy. If there isn't, change the target to the player. And that was pretty much it. And the final problem I will talk about with the dummy is how I dealt with what to do in the case of multiple dummies on the field. And just using the current test numbers that we have on it, it is possible for there to be multiple dummies on the field with how long the dummy lasts and how long the dummy's cooldown is. So what I decided to do is, if there's already a dummy on the field and you place another one, it destroys the old one. The reason I decided this was from two directions. The first one is that it would be kind of overpowered if you could do that in the game and have multiple enemies lined up on one dummy and then they instantly line up onto the other one, and that gives you a lot more free time. And the second is that, golly, it would be really annoying to try to get that to work. There would have to be all sorts of checks of, oh, this dummy is down and there's another dummy, and assigning stuff, etc., etc. I don't think it would be that difficult, just another kind of tedious one. The main reason though is I think that it would be less fun, and the option of the old one being destroyed I think makes it so that the player has to be more intentional with a dummy as a tool and as a resource, especially if they only have a certain amount. Like if we decide to make the dummy certain amount of uses per room or a certain amount of uses per floor, that makes their usage of it have to be very intentional. Now, the weapon firing system that I built for this game is something that I'm actually proud about. If we look at it here, all these variables are things you can enable, disable, change to create just about any type of standard bullet firing weapon with all sorts of quirky things you can do. The perfect example being is this test weapon, which if you've seen in any of my other previous videos, you've seen this giant spray of bullets all over the screen. And in order to make that, all I do is set this value to 360, and now the weapon shoots in a full circle. One type of weapon I hadn't set this script up for is a weapon that has a wind-up period. If you think of a Gatling gun, in most games when you use it, the fire rate starts out slow, but then speeds up to a maximum fire rate. And I wanted to make something like that, but given the complexity and customizability of all my other variables, most of the solutions I could think of had an equation where you just plug in numbers, and that would make it really difficult to make something as expansive as and customizable as all my other stuff is for the weapons. And that was till I came across a variable called an animation curve. So an animation curve is a variable that is a graph with an X and a Y axis. And on this graph, you can draw whatever type of line that you want. And from this, the Y axis becomes the value that you read from the position on the X axis. So what if I assigned time to the x-axis and assigned fire rate to the y-axis? If I inject time into the x-axis and have it go over time, like start firing and then go down over time with a max limit, and then have it go back down with a minimum limit when you're not firing, I can read whatever value at y and have that be the fire rate. Using this animation curve, I can now draw whatever type of weird graph I want to, and this will be reflective in the fire rate of the weapon. I can start slow and then eventually get fast. I can start fast and then eventually get slow. I can make it oscillate between fast and slow with a really long time, and all sorts of silly customization that I can do simply by drawing it into this line and then changing these few other values. And then the script does the rest for me without having to do weird calculus for every single type of curve that I wanted to make if I didn't have an animation curve. As the final addition, I also entered an option where the player can be slowed down as long as they are holding the fire button. The number you enter is a multiple of their current speed. So for example, if you enter 0.7 and the player's speed is 100, they will move at 70 speed while firing. You can also do a high number. If you give them 1.5, they will actually move at 150 speed while firing. Again, this is tons of built-in customization that only takes clicking this button as true or false and then changing the value, and then boom, now the player plays with this weapon differently than they would something that doesn't do that. And I think that'll open up a lot of weapon creation for us as the designers to give the player something interesting to play with and give them lots of decisions as they are playing with these two additions to the weapon system. This is one that made me a little bit grumpy. So one of the enemies in this game is a Sentry. And for the Sentry, this is another script that I'm proud of, where I gave all sorts of customization options so that we can make multiple types of sentries, all based upon this one script. And if we need to balance it, all we have to do is change these numbers. It's very easy. And so one of the primary mechanics is this view cone, which acts as its viewable range, sort of like, literally like a view cone in a lot of stealth games. In order to make this, I followed a tutorial on YouTube. The tutorial that I followed made the cone a mesh object so that it adapts to the obstacles that are in its way. So of course it, stops at a wall and can't see past the wall. And I made this a long time ago, probably over a year and a half ago. I let it sit, and then while testing something recently, I found this bug. The bug is where the mesh would just sometimes disappear. I was running around the Sentry, and then at certain angles, the mesh would just disappear. And I could not figure out why. And the short of it was that after a lot of testing, it was because the transform of the mesh or its position left the camera's view frustum, which is just what the camera can see pretty much. And for its initial design, when it first spawned into the world, its position would be 0, 0, the center of the map. But the cone would be drawn wherever the enemy was because the cone wasn't tied directly to its transform as long as the transform never moved. And I didn't realize that, and I guess when I tested it before, 0, 0 never exited the camera's view. That also didn't help that the camera used to be zoomed out a fair bit more than it is now, which made it leaving the view a little bit more likely. And remember, this came from a YouTube tutorial, which will come in a second. So I messed around with a lot of fixes, messed around with the camera and mesh, trying to make it so that the camera didn't call the mesh when it was off screen, tried to tie the transform of the mesh to the player at all times, and then the mesh would always try to draw itself relative to the transform on top of the enemy or the position of the Sentry, a whole list of garbage. And I tried looking at the video a time or two in the comments to really try to confirm if the video was missing something, and I couldn't find anything, so I finally signed up to that YouTuber's website, made an account, downloaded the project files. It was free, I will give him that. Going through the code of the view cone, there was one individual line that was missing from the video, and this one line declares the bounds of the mesh. Don't worry about those details. And so I just put in that line, and then it worked. Having that knowledge, I now dug through the comments of the video again and did eventually find somebody that was having the same problem and their solution, which was slightly different than the one in his code, but both work. Thank that person, and I am using their line since it recalculates the bounds. I'm not sure which is faster, but I'm sticking to the one in the YouTube comments just because, that was frustrating. And it's actually not the first time that happened with that YouTuber, even though I haven't used specific tutorials very often, and I can't remember what the first one was, but I do remember having to fight something, and the solution ended up being something he'd cut out of the video for some reason. I think I found it in the comments again, or maybe it was in the video and he showed it for a fraction of a second. I remember having to watch the video at 0.25 speed and constantly pause the video because there were some times where the code will be up just for just for a second, and I would have to make sure and then read it all just to make sure I got everything. I was really beginning, I was going to have to cut the view cone because it looked so bad. The view cone on the Sentry was an option for a type of Sentry, so it could be cut and the Sentry could still be fine because it looks so bad flashing out of existence. But it's fixed, it's solved now, so it gets to stay. Now on to the next thing. Since it had been a while since my last video, around the end of 2024, the beginning of this year, I wanted to make a sort of top 10 list. In this video, I wanted to focus on not what I've made, but the best games I've played, the best books and manga that I've read, the best anime and movies that I've watched. The purpose of this video was going to be to give the viewer more of an understanding of what inspires me as a creator and the kind of things that I am into, but the video fell through and I cut it. Before the story of why that happened, I'm going to give you the list to hold you over, and I really want to get into the details of each entry on why they're on that list, and I will keep the improvisation to a minimum. It's just simply to give you a title, and if you're interested, look it up. Everything on this list I highly recommend. So for my top games, I picked 10. Metroid Prime 3, Babdi, Resident Evil 4, Psychonauts 2, Spec Ops The Line, that was a replay, Nier, Murder by Numbers. I had beaten it a separate year, but I came back to do Completionist, do all the levels. Sin and Punishment Star Successor, this was another replay. I did it on hard. Metroid Dread, Sekiro, this was one I've already played as well. I came back just to do Completionist and get all the achievements. It is my favorite of the FromSoft games I've played so far. Bloodborne and Shadow of the Erdtree being the only two I haven't played. And then my game of the year is Disco Elysium, actual masterpiece. That's what I'll say about that. The top manga that I read are Spirit Circle, The Climber, Blom, Pluto, and Goodnight Poon Poon. Again, Goodnight Poon Poon, actual masterpiece. Not many people I would recommend it to just because it's difficult and challenging in the things that happen, but it's an actual masterpiece, and I think it's a very important work. The top anime that I watched, which for this year or 2024 wasn't very much. I'm going to start out with Pale Cocoon. This was another rewatch. It's just a 24-minute episode. This was one that I randomly found one time, and I love finding those hidden gems just randomly and being surprised. I really enjoy that, and this was one of those. Ergo Proxy, that was a rewatch. Enjoyed it a lot more the second time around than I did when I watched it probably in high school. Ghost in the Shell, the movie. For whatever reason, I haven't seen that yet. Mob Psycho 100. And then for the top anime of the year is the movie The End of Evangelion. Neon Genesis Evangelion is my favorite anime. And this was probably the fourth time I've watched End of Eva, maybe the fifth. But this time, it came out in theaters, so I went and saw it in theaters, and it was excellent. And then the top books that I had read, The Bell Jar, the first two Foundation books, I still need to buy the third one, The Noble Eightfold Path, The Last Question, The Tao Te Ching, and the Zhuangzi. I'm just bundling those together. I can do what I want. And then Cat's Cradle. Cat's Cradle I had read in high school. I remember not thinking much of it, and then for whatever reason I wanted to reread it, and I did, and it was absolutely phenomenal. Kurt Vonnegut, it feels like he knows so much when you read it, and his humor is always knowing. Really enjoy that book. Now, why did I cut it? First, it started out as I wrote a 10-page single-space document, and before I was even done, I decided to abandon that document. Mainly because it was significantly too long, rambly, and it did not achieve much other than, simply Hermer thing good. It was boring, and it wasn't worth as much time as it would have taken to make. And then, so I started a second document. In this document, I took the list, the one I just read out to you, and positioned its focus rather than on simply being my top stuff and giving my good praises on them. I wanted to rather focus on specific elements of these pieces and how they use their mechanics or structure or something else to convey an idea, to convey an emotion. For example, to talk about Resident Evil 4, I would have talked about how it uses its various mechanics to create a sensation of being overwhelmed. And I found this video and its concept really promising. I got a considerable amount into, and so far for this entire video, I'm probably about 8 to 10 hours into the whole writing process, including the other draft, just for this one video. And I got stuck on quite a number of them, and it also began to suffer from becoming too long and too rambly. It was a really good writing exercise, but I decided to cut it because it was running up against the same difficulties as the other draft. Writing it was only part of the work, then there was recording the dialogue, getting footage, etc., etc., etc. I had to cut it for the sake of the game because it would have taken 10, 15 more hours to do that video, which is 10 to 15 hours. It would not go into making the game, so I cut it. That is everything that I've got for now, though. I'm going to go back to working on getting this playtest ready. I imagine I will make a video about the results of that playtest and our plans to address and move forward with whatever those results are. We shall see once we get there, though. In the meantime, take it easy.